Bissell, in turn, talks with a man named Sidney Gottlieb, who's a larger-than-life character. He was the CIA's top chemist and sort of the science guru at the CIA. And Gottlieb picks a poison, which we now know to be anthrax, and flies it to Leopoldville with a syringe, rubber gloves, a mask, and meets up with Larry Devlin, the CIA station chief in Congo, and hands him the poison and says, "You need to find a way to get this into Lumumba's food or toothpaste."
This is Rhyming Chaos, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval, tyranny, or authoritarian takeover. I'm Jeremy Goldkorn, and I come to you from the heart of Red America in Nashville, Tennessee, a long way from Beijing, my former home of 20 years, and even longer away from Johannesburg, where I was born just around the block and a month after Elon Musk. Today, we're going back to the Congo, the country now known as Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, back to the year 1960. 20 years before Pete Hegseth was born, which I mentioned as a teaser for one of the topics we'll be discussing today. This is our second episode at Rhyming Chaos on the Congo. We last discussed the country on an episode titled Mobutu, the dictator who wanted to make Zaire great again, with the scholar Pedro Monaville. I myself have been interested in Congo for a long time, at least since high school in Johannesburg when I read Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness, which is set there, although more people are familiar with the story through its retelling in the film Apocalypse Now, which moves the location to Southeast Asia. But Congo is geographically the heart of the African continent, and I think it's fair to say in some ways it's the site of the most fevered imaginings of Westerners about Africa, from Heart of Darkness to things like the Rumble in the Jungle boxing match in Kinshasa. I myself traveled in Congo in the early 1990s, and back then it felt to me almost like the USA of Africa. It's a huge country. It's about a third the size of the US, with continental-sized rivers, snow-capped peaks in the Ruwenzori Mountains in the east. And it's really ethnically and linguistically diverse. I think there are about 250 languages. And Congo also gave birth to what you could say is the rock and roll of Africa, the infectious guitar-heavy sounds of Congolese rumba, which you can hear playing across the African continent. I first heard Congolese rumba in Zambia, and in the early 1990s, as soon as you left the sort of cultural influence of South Africa and Namibia and Botswana and Zimbabwe, you'd hear Congolese music. But that sweet music's also been the soundtrack to a lot of horrible events. Congo's post-colonial history hasn't been sweet, and today we're going to discuss some of the nasty things that happened in the Congo in 1960, a year of great change. My guest today is Stuart Reid, author of The Lumumba Plot, a rip-roaring read about the CIA plot to assassinate the newly independent Congo's charismatic Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba. Stuart has written for many publications, including The New York Times, The Atlantic, Bloomberg, Businessweek, and interviewed many world leaders for foreign affairs, including Congo President Joseph Kabila and African billionaire mobile phone entrepreneur Mo Ibrahim, and French far-right National Front leader Marine Le Pen. Welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Stuart.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeremy.
I'm going to continue blabbing on a bit to try and set the scene for our story. So after a brutal colonial rule from 1885 to 1960, as King Leopold of Belgium's personal property and then as a colony of the Belgian state, Congo gained independence in 1960, but the country was immediately beset by internal political divisions, Cold War machinations, and a greedy scramble for control of the country's mineral wealth. Patrice Lumumba, who championed a strong centralized government, became prime minister alongside President Joseph Kabila, who preferred a looser federal structure, but almost instantly the fragile compromise fell apart. An army mutiny followed, the secession of Katanga, the resource-rich province where the mining billions are. Belgium sent troops supposedly to protect its nationals, but strategically deployed them to Katanga to shore up the breakaway regime there. The UN proved unwilling to intervene in Katanga, and Lumumba turned to the Soviet Union. For Washington and its allies, this transformed him from a nationalist leader into a Cold War threat. He was sidelined by a military coup led by Colonel Joseph Mobutu, who went on to rule Congo as president and changed the country's name to Zaire, and his own name to Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngabendu Waza Banga. But back in 1960, that was the year Elvis Presley returned home from Germany after 2 years of military service. The US announced that 3,500 American soldiers would be sent to Vietnam. President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act. The birth control pill was approved by the FDA. The Soviets launched Sputnik. And then John F. Kennedy was elected president. So if we think 2025 is a roller coaster, we've had them before. There was a lot going on. So that's the year of Congo becoming independent. Stuart, can you kind of flesh out this picture that I tried to lay of Congo in the 1960s and correct anything I may have got wrong? And who were the major players at the time of independence? And why was the US involved in the first place?
So no one really expected that Congo would be an important country to pay attention to in the summer of 1960. Piece of evidence for this is that the United States had sent a young CIA officer there to be station chief, and it wasn't on anyone's list of upcoming crises. And that changed very quickly. As you mentioned, immediately after independence, there was the spark that really began the wildfire was the mutiny in the army. So as a sort of holdover from colonial days, the new country had an all-white officer corps, mostly Belgian, and then a black rank and file saluting these white officers. As you might imagine, that did not prove to be a popular arrangement among the rank and file, who expected independence to mean independence and that they would no longer have to obey their Belgian overseers. So on July 5th, 1960, Congo had become independent on June 30th. There's a mutiny in the army, and soldiers are running wild through the streets, and that sets off a lot of different things that make this a world crisis. The Belgian population flees, instantly removing the sort of expertise from the country, because under the Belgian colonial system, the Congolese were deliberately kept back from advancing, and they weren't allowed to hold opportunities and positions above a certain level. So very quickly, the Congo lost, air traffic controllers, doctors, judges, all sort of the experts who were really making the country work at a day-to-day level. The mutiny also triggered a Belgian military intervention. Ostensibly, the Belgians were protecting the civilians, their citizens, but to the Congolese, it looked like a recolonization, and it was effectively a foreign invasion, where the former colonial power was invading a now sovereign country.
The logic, a little like Putin's Ukraine logic, that protecting Russians.
Yes, with a much more compressed timeline from the most recent actual rule. And so that set off this massive crisis, and order had broken down in the Congo. And so Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, in desperation, called on the United Nations for help. He and President Kasavubu were sort of flying around the country trying to quell the mutiny, and sent a cable to Dag Hammarskjöld in New York requesting some sort of help. And that drew the UN into the crisis, and that sort of internationalized it.
Dag Hammarskjöld was the head of the UN.
He was Secretary General of the UN at the time.
Secretary General, yeah.
And so that internationalized the crisis. So all of a sudden you have the United Nations Security Council having to decide whether to authorize some sort of help for Congo, which it does. And there's a really impressive peacekeeping operation that's put together just in a matter of days. And it was really the first of its kind. The UN had peacekeeping operations before, but they were mostly smaller missions, often unarmed, and sort of observers who would monitor a truce, usually in the Middle East. And so this was a very different operation where you had thousands of troops, mostly from fellow independent African countries. You had the Americans and the British and the Soviets contributing airlift capacities. The Canadians were, because they were bilingual, providing communications help. So it was really this sort of moment of international coming together, organized by Hammarskjöld and the UN, where the UN troops and experts were going to put the country back together again, stabilize it, and set Congo on a path towards, a sustainable, peaceful post-independence trajectory. that did not go as planned. And long story short, the real sticking point was the secession of Katanga, which, as you mentioned, is the mineral-rich province in Congo's southeast, which that secession was backed by Belgian interests. And sort of as the rest of the country fell into chaos, the idea was that there would be this pro-Belgian enclave of stability. And of course, not coincidentally, where all the money came from. And Lumumba wanted the UN to end that secession. He thought, I invited in these troops, I can tell them what to do. Hammarskjöld, representing the UN and the Security Council, did not think that they had the authority to actually forcibly integrate Katanga back into the central government's fold. They didn't want a war. So that was the real sticking point between Lumumba and the UN, which then set the course for everything that followed.
And what followed was he looked around the world and looked at his options, and he looked towards Moscow. Is that right?
Yes, but there's an important intermediary step, which is that he looked towards the United States before he went to the Soviets. So Lumumba is frustrated with the UN. He takes a trip to New York City in late July 1960, so just weeks after independence, meets with Hammarskjöld at the UN. It's a totally unproductive meeting. They're sort of talking past each other and have completely different styles. Hammarskjöld sort of viewed Lumumba as too impatient, and Lumumba viewed Hammarskjöld as too sort of legalistic and not willing to do enough about Katanga. And then Lumumba goes to Washington, D.C., where he hopes to meet with President Eisenhower. Eisenhower's out of town, so he gets an audience only with the Secretary of State, Christian Herter, and some of his aides. And he's asking the U.S. for what the UN won't give him, which is military aid and support for taking back Katanga. And the U.S. brushes him off. And so it's then and only then that Lumumba turns to the Soviet Union. And this would later, and at the time, become evidence of his supposed communist sympathies. But if you actually look at the record, it's clear that Lumumba was more naturally inclined to be pro-American. I mean, the best example of this is that while he was in Washington, D.C., he called on the United States to send American troops to Congo, which is hardly the type of thing that a Soviet stooge would demand. So it's his decision to sort of play footsie with Khrushchev that really marks the beginning of the end for Lumumba.
Yeah, that reminds me a little of African and Latin American and some Asian countries with China now. And you sometimes get the sort of commentary from the US, why are you doing business with these nasty Chinese communists? And the answer is, well, they're there, which I suppose has some long history. So how big of a factor was Lumumba's seeking help from the USSR in his falling out of favor with the Belgians and the US and the separatists in Katanga and President Kasavubu, in terms of trying to understand what followed? Was that the major factor in the subsequent events, or was that just one of many things that led to it?
He lost the Belgians early on. I mean, they hated him before independence. They tried to prevent him from becoming prime minister through various political machinations, unsuccessfully. So there were pro-Belgian politicians in Congo. Lumumba was absolutely not one of them. So he insulted, in the Belgian view, he insulted the Belgian king on Independence Day by giving a speech, condemning Belgian colonialism. So the Belgians were predisposed to dislike Lumumba. And once he lost control of his country and with the army mutiny, he was unrecoverable in their view. And the same would go for the separatists in Katanga, who had been itching for their own reasons to have independence or some sort of loose confederation for a long time. But he hadn't yet, in, let's say, early, mid-July 1960, lost the Americans. But that really changed with his outreach to the Soviet Union, and that was the decisive factor in the CIA putting into motion this bizarre plot to assassinate Lumumba.
Maybe we could sort of talk a little bit about the sort of way of thinking about the Soviet Union, the domino theory, which you don't go into great detail in your book, but I have a very graphic memory of it because I went to a public primary school, elementary school in South Africa. And in grade 7, we were sent to, it was called Felt School, which was bush school, basically. And it was kind of healthy outdoor activities and, finding your way around the woods with no equipment. And then a bit of indoctrination about apartheid in the evening around the campfire. And we were taught about this terrifying domino theory. So one of the reasons the apartheid government justified its existence, of course, was that it was a bulwark against communism, which was creeping towards us as one domino after another fell. Could you just talk a little bit about the sort of almost paranoia in Washington, D.C. at the time about the Soviet Union's growing influence?
Yeah, well, paranoia is absolutely the right word. I mean, the funny thing about the domino theory is that there was, in fact, no example you can point to of it truly happening. That, a communist revolution in one country spreads to a neighbor and so on. So it was a theory that had very little evidence behind it. And, when writing the book, one of the things I had to be careful with is it's easy in retrospect to, look at that paranoia and dismiss it as silly and find it hard to understand. I think you have to remember how recent World War II was, and also the situation in Eastern Europe with Soviet domination. But even so, it was excessive. So the US viewed the third world, as it was then called, as sort of up for grabs. And there was this competition between the US and the Soviet Union to win over these countries that were newly entering international life. Now, the problem was the Soviets, it turns out, were not particularly interested in Africa and specifically Congo in 1960. 1960 was, relatively early in the Cold War. The Soviets were not as powerful as they would become. Congo was a long way away from Moscow, and the Soviets had limited air transport capacity. Khrushchev took a ship to New York in the fall of 1960 when he attended the UN General Assembly because he wanted to be spared the embarrassment of having to fly and stop over mid-route because there was no Soviet plane that could make the entire trip.
Wow, that's remarkable.
So if you look at how the US interpreted every Congolese action, it was often through the lens of the Cold War and imagining that every decision Lumumba made was motivated by somehow his trying to play in the Cold War conflict. When the Soviet archives were opened after the Cold War, it turned out that there wasn't much in them about Congo because, as I said, it was viewed as a peripheral concern in a faraway place where the Soviet Union couldn't have much influence. They certainly made political hay of Belgium's and the United States' actions in Congo, but it really went no further than that. I think there were only 2 or 3 KGB agents in Leopoldville at the time. And another relevant fact here is that when Lumumba requested Soviet aid, Khrushchev's reaction was, oh, shoot, now I'm going to have to give him some sort of token aid because the Soviets had issued all sorts of statements about the, evil imperialists and their actions, but they didn't actually expect their bluff to be called and have to ante up. And so the Soviet Union really gave Lumumba token military aid. Some trucks that were already en route as part of the UN effort were reclassified as, for the Congolese government. And then some Soviet planes, it's not exactly clear whether they actually ended up in Congo, but were sent en route. And then maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but the political situation on the ground in Leopoldville changed to render the little Soviet aid that Lumumba did get entirely moot.
So how was the decision made for the CIA to assassinate Lumumba?
The key moment here is an August 18th, 1960 National Security Council meeting in the White House, where Eisenhower is meeting with his top lieutenants, and the Congo is the subject of the meeting, and Lumumba's latest policies come up. And then Eisenhower says something to the effect of Lumumba needs to be permanently eliminated. And he looks at Alan Dulles, the director of the CIA, as he says this. Now, we know this for a few reasons. One, the note taker at the meeting would later testify to the Church Committee, which was looking into CIA misdeeds, that Eisenhower had said something to the effect of Lumumba needs to be assassinated, and the entire room understood exactly what he meant and was shocked into a 15-second silence. So that's one data point. Another data point is I was in the Eisenhower archives, the presidential library in Kansas, and I came across handwritten notes from the meeting, which have the word Lumumba and then a big black X next to the name, which is not proof, but does sort of add to the picture. But most importantly, we know what happens next, which is that the president's national security advisor, Gordon Gray, speaks with Alan Dulles a week after the meeting and sort of follows up and says, hey, you know that thing that the president talked about, like, we need some action on that. And so Dulles had, somewhat amusingly, originally tried to just, it seems, ignore this apparent assassination order. And it was only after the national security advisor followed up and said, okay, you need to do this, that he sprung into action.
It's almost like a kind of parody of a corporate sort of management tactic when you don't want to get something done.
Indeed. And it shows you that there are other cases where the CIA was going rogue in the Cold War and doing its own thing and getting, ahead of what it had been instructed to do. This is not one of those cases. This is Eisenhower wanted something done, and he forced the CIA to do it. And so Alan Dulles then tells his deputy, a man named Richard Bissell, to put in motion some effort to assassinate Lumumba. Bissell, in turn, talks with a man named Sidney Gottlieb, who's a larger-than-life character. He was the CIA's top chemist and sort of the science guru at the CIA. And Gottlieb picks a poison, which we now know to be anthrax, and flies it to Leopoldville with a syringe, rubber gloves, a mask, and meets up with Larry Devlin, the CIA station chief in Congo, and hands him the poison and says, you need to find a way to get this into Lumumba's food or toothpaste. So it sounds like it's out of a spy fiction, but it really happened. We have the cable traffic. We have the testimony from Devlin and others admitting this later. And it goes back to, it speaks to the paranoia that you talked about, that Lumumba was seen as uniquely dangerous and pro-Soviet, that he had to be physically killed in order to prevent the Congo from turning red.
Yeah, it is amazing, especially since Lumumba, of all the African independence leaders of that era, is the one who has this sort of almost student-like air. He's somebody who doesn't project menace at all. From the video footage we have, I suppose times have changed so much that it's very difficult for me to appreciate the way they were thinking back then.
Yeah, well, I want to get at another factor here, which is important to mention, which is simply racism. I mean, there was this view, and you see it in all the documents, that Africans in general, and the Congolese in this case, were not to be trusted as independent political leaders and needed tutelage. And so there's this very paternalistic attitude that they could not be trusted. And so you see constant references to Lumumba as a, quote, child. You see this with the UN documents and the US documents, certainly the Belgian documents. And so it's hard to imagine this happening in Eastern Europe, for instance. There does seem to be something particular about the way Eisenhower, Dulles, other officials viewed Africans in general and Congolese in particular at that time that made them less worthy of dignity and sovereignty.
Yeah, actually, no, I get it. If I put myself in the mindset of apartheid South Africa, which it is horribly easy for me to do, then it all makes perfect sense. Let's zoom in on CIA Station Chief Larry Devlin, who's also a kind of a larger-than-life character who was in charge of the CIA's operations in the Congo. So he was based in Leopoldville, as you mentioned, I think, now Kinshasa, the capital. Who was he? What kind of man was he? What was his background?
So he was a World War II veteran from San Diego. He ended up going to Harvard for grad school and was recruited by McGeorge Bundy, of all people, and brought into the CIA in that very early days.
Sorry, Steve, could you explain George Bundy for, especially my non-American listeners might not be familiar?
George Bundy, yeah. So I think at that time he was out of government. He ended up being an influential figure in the Kennedy and then Johnson administrations, and was intimately involved in U.S. policy towards Vietnam. I think at that time, actually, he was leading a Council on Foreign Relations study group. But especially in that era, there was, the line between elites in and out of government was very permeable, but sort of classic establishment figure. And the recruitment process was, again, out of a movie. It was, a professor invited Devlin over to speak, and who was there but George Bundy. And so one thing led to another. Devlin joins the CIA, which at that point is a new agency. And he's stationed in Europe and then eventually first, I think, France and then Belgium. His cover is as a travel writer for Fedors, which was useful because you could travel all around Europe and take notes and pictures and not attract suspicion. By the time he's posted to Leopoldville, he's 38 years old. Again, evidence of how, this was not a top priority in the CIA, this country. And I think what distinguishes him and what explains a lot of his actions in the Congo is he was very much a can-do person, a man of action who took things into his own hands and made decisions on the ground. And, in those days, communication was not what it is today. And so officers had a lot more leeway and would have to do things on their own without constantly checking back with headquarters. And Devlin also had a way with people. His admirers and critics would all admit that. And so he became very close to Joseph Mobutu, who turned out to be the key figure in our story here. So now, Devlin, he was a very effective CIA officer. I think he also fundamentally got Congolese politics wrong, and he succumbed to that paranoia that we talked about, misjudged Lumumba as pro-Soviet or sympathetic towards communism, when in fact, the best way of thinking of Lumumba is as a nationalist, an anti-colonial leader. And, one test of whether we can judge people in retrospect for making decisions we consider wrong is whether other people were arguing the opposite case at the time. And indeed, there were people in the State Department writing memos about, you read them today and you think that's exactly right. Lumumba is a nationalist, not a communist. He would not likely submit to Soviet domination, having, battled Belgian and colonialism for years. But Devlin and most of the CIA just didn't see it that way.
So how specifically did he get his instructions? Was it a phone call or a cable?
So Devlin gets a cable saying, look out for someone who will arrive and introduce himself as Sid from Paris. You'll recognize him. And the cable, I believe, came under the name of Alan Dulles himself, which was highly unusual and signaled that this was, super top secret and very important. And then he meets Sidney Gottlieb at a cafe across the street from the U.S. Embassy, I believe, and recognizes him from, they'd crossed paths at headquarters before. And that's where Gottlieb tells him about this assassination operation. Devlin would later testify, and this is sort of a key link in back to the White House, that Devlin asked Gottlieb, who authorized this mission? And he was told the president authorized it.
But he didn't actually carry out the plot. Why not?
Well, here we get into sort of bureaucratic delays and changing Congolese politics. So Eisenhower had uttered this order back in August, but by the time the poison actually made its way to Congo, it was mid-September or early September, and a lot had changed on the ground. President Kasavubu had announced that he was dismissing Lumumba. Lumumba turned around and said, you can't fire me, I fire you. And then into that standoff steps Mobutu, who was head of the army and had been talking with Devlin. Devlin had given him money after Mobutu said he would like to step in and, effect a coup. And so Mobutu is now in charge. Lumumba is under house arrest. And there's this practical problem where Devlin or, any associates he's paying can't actually get access to Lumumba's house. Ironically, because of other U.S. actions supporting of the Mobutu coup mainly. So Lumumba's living in his house. He's surrounded by a ring of UN troops who are protecting him, and then an outer ring of Congolese troops who are itching to arrest him and preventing him from escaping. And so that's the reason the poisoning plot sort of fizzles out. Devlin sends cables back to headquarters proposing alternate methods of assassination, requesting a hunting rifle, talking about various subplots he's working on, but none of these come to pass. And in fact, by that point, there's less of a need, quote unquote, to get rid of Lumumba because he's out of power and the United States has temporarily at least achieved its objective of installing a pliant leader in this country.
But Lumumba's not long for this world anyway. So what happens to him?
So things change later on in 1960 because Mobutu's military government is not working that well. The country is still in chaos. Katanga is still not integrated. And so there develops this thinking among certain people in the UN and then certain American policymakers who work for the incoming President John F. Kennedy that Lumumba needs to be brought back to power. So in November 1960, JFK defeats Richard Nixon, and Kennedy is scheduled to be inaugurated in January 61. And Kennedy had a subset of advisors who were arguing, reasonably, in my view, that the way to solve the Congo crisis was to bring Lumumba back to power in some form. After all, he was the country's legitimate, democratically elected prime minister. He was the most popular political figure in the Congo, and you couldn't really have Congolese politics without him. And the source of the chaos at the time, these advisors argued, was Mobutu and his military rule. And there were people in the UN who also were rowing in that direction. So this idea develops among Mobutu's circle to get rid of Lumumba. So Mobutu knows, he can see that there's this movement to bring Lumumba back to power, which would, of course, mean the end of Mobutu's political career. Larry Devlin understands that there's this possibility that Lumumba might come back. And so, and I should add one more thing, and not to complicate it too much, but Lumumba escaped house arrest and then was captured with CIA help by Mobutu's men. And so now he's in a military prison rather than under house arrest. And there's this movement to transfer him to a province where it's certain he'll be killed, to not do the dirty work himself. Mobutu didn't have to do it himself, but to have others do his work for him. And so there are two provinces, both secessionist provinces, Katanga, which you've mentioned, South Kasai, which we have not mentioned. And both were secessionist provinces whose leaders had promised to kill Lumumba if he set foot on their soil. And so the timing here is important. So it's January 1961 now. On January 14th, Devlin learns from Mobutu or someone in his circle that Lumumba, prisoner Lumumba, is about to be transferred to his death. What does Devlin do with this information? Well, two things. One, he doesn't try and talk Mobutu out of this plan, which he easily could have done. He was paying him satchels full of cash and was advising him on every matter of Congolese politics intimately. And two, he does not tell headquarters back in the US about the most important development in Congo. Why does he not explain that this is about to happen? Because he realizes correctly that if he does, he'll be told to put the brakes on the operation. This was a moment of transition between administrations. When Devlin had asked for more money to pay off Mobutu, he had been told, you need to wait a few weeks. This is a question for the new administration. We can't have big policy changes in the Congo now. So Devlin decides to sit on this information to prevent anyone from telling him to stop it. And then on January 17th, only then does he tell headquarters what's happening. And that's because that's the day Lumumba is transferred to Katanga, as it would turn out. And it was too late to stop the transfer. So Lumumba is flown from his prison not far from Leopoldville all the way to the capital of Katanga, Elizabethville. He's tortured the whole flight. His beard is ripped out. He's beaten to a pulp. He's dragged out of the plane, taken to a house near the airport in Katanga, tortured more, and then late at night driven out into the woods where a Congolese firing squad under the command of Belgian officers who are still in control in Katanga, who in turn were answering to the secessionist leaders, that he was shot by a firing squad and killed. And that was January 17th. And then 3 days later, Kennedy was inaugurated president.
Wow. So Devlin failed to carry out the plot himself, but I mean, he effectively signed Lumumba's death warrant, or at least made sure there was no possibility that he could be saved by delaying informing Washington.
Yeah, the way I characterize it is that Devlin gave a green light to Mobutu to send Lumumba to his death. He could easily have prevented it, and he chose not to.
And there is an interesting sort of follow-up to that assassination, which was that they tried to destroy his body except for one little piece. Could you tell the story of the destruction of Lumumba's corpse and the tooth?
Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of interesting and gruesome story. So Lumumba is initially buried in a shallow grave near where he was shot. Then the secessionist government starts to panic and is worried about evidence getting out. They had also come up with this cover story and claimed that Lumumba had escaped and was missing and on the run. And his death actually only became known publicly, I think maybe a month after it happened. So there's a group of Belgian police officers who's tasked with exhuming Lumumba's body, reburying it, and then this turns out to be not permanent enough. And so then they exhume it a second time and dissolve it in sulfuric acid. One of the Belgian policemen who is tasked with this gruesome job keeps as a sort of sick souvenir, I think, two of Lumumba's molars and then one of his fingers. And we don't really know what happened to the finger, but one of the molars he ended up taking back to Belgium after he retired. And then after he died, his daughter took possession of it. And then in, I think, 2016, she did an interview with a Belgian magazine and, revealed, oh yeah, I still have Lumumba's molar in my, this special box here. And then that set off a Belgian police investigation. The family had, understandably complained. And it has, I wouldn't call it a happy ending, but sort of the right thing was eventually done, which was that the tooth was returned to the Lumumba family by the Belgian government, flown back to Congo, and then sort of toured the country and eventually placed in a specially built mausoleum in Kinshasa. So the sole remaining part of Lumumba was finally repatriated.
Yeah, that is amazing. It does sort of illustrate the cruelty of that era, the cold-hearted, keeping of the souvenir from the horrible murder and burning and almost, movie-like burning in sulfuric acid.
Absolutely. And I think there was this sense, too, that the normal rules didn't apply in Congo and that it was this seen as this uncivilized place where the sort of law of the jungle applied. And therefore, the US and the Belgians could be party to or permit a level of violence that they wouldn't have elsewhere.
Yeah, and to some extent, I think that that idea continues to this day with the abuses you see in the mineral mines there. So after all of this, Devlin stays in the Congo. And what was his role in maintaining US relations with Mobutu?
So his first stint in Congo, which began at the time of independence, lasted until 1963, when he was promoted, because he was seen as a successful CIA station chief. He was promoted to run the East Africa branch at headquarters. But he alone had a good relationship with Mobutu. And so he kept getting pulled back into Congo affairs because he was seen as sort of the only person who knew Mobutu well enough, could reason with him, just had, that relationship born at a time of crisis and lubricated by ample cash. And so then in 1965, he begins his second stint as station chief in Congo. That is also the year when Mobutu launches his second coup and sort of formally takes control for himself, as opposed to being the power behind the throne. And then Devlin is promoted, leaves Congo and goes to Laos, of all places, and eventually retires from the agency. Sort of there was nowhere up for him to go. He maxed out at a certain point. And then where does he end up, of all places? Congo, of course. And he's there not as in any official capacity, but as the representative of the American diamond merchant, Maurice Tempelsman. And so Devlin has been hired for his access to Mobutu, which is, the key thing you need to get anything done in the country at the time. And U.S. ambassadors would complain that Devlin, a retired CIA officer now working for a diamond merchant, had far better access to Mobutu than they did, representatives of the country that was funding his regime to the tune of millions and millions of dollars a year. Mobutu was a difficult client. I mean, that's another one of the ironies of the whole experience that the U.S. had in Congo, is that they were supposedly installing this pliant pro-American leader, but he ended up being very difficult to manage and would do things like invite North Korean military advisors in, kick out 2 successive U.S. ambassadors for failing to show him enough deference. But Devlin was able to manage that relationship with Mobutu.
Right. He had the personal touch. You recently did a Spycast podcast with Sasha Ingber, 2 episodes, and one of them featured audio of Devlin before he died, I think in 2008. He was talking about his life, and he said he had no regrets about his activities in the Congo, that he was a soldier in a war that had to be fought, more or less. How widespread is that view among the US intelligence community and in government now when looking back on that time? And is there much... and I understand, obviously, that everything must have been completely upended in the last 10 months or so. But at least prior to that, has there been any official recognition of what really were absolute failures of US Cold War policies in Congo and elsewhere around the world?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's that surprising that Devlin himself never admitted that he was wrong. I mean, people don't like to do that in general, and his whole career was tied to this glory moment in Congo. In my limited experience, I think there are members of the intelligence community, those that I've met, that happily accept that the agency made mistakes in Congo in 1960 and many other places. I received a thoughtful and favorable review, to my surprise and delight, in the CIA's own journal, Studies in Intelligence. And I think there are plenty of modern day CIA officers who are not, tied to the agency's past. And it's now been, 60 plus years. So long enough that I think there's no one's personal reputation or even really institutional reputation that's tied up. Now, that said, there's been no official recognition or apology of what's been done. It hasn't happened under any past recent administrations. I certainly don't expect it from this one. And what I think would be most meaningful is simply an opening of the vault. To my deep frustration, while I was working on this book, there were still documents that were classified or portions of them that were redacted, which is just silly this many years on. There's literally nothing from 1960 that I think should be secret anymore. And the first step to atonement is honesty and finding out what exactly was done. And there's still, unanswered questions and details that have not yet been revealed.
And I mean, even if not atonement, at least the pursuit of professionalism, one would learn from one's former mistakes. I can't sense that in looking at current US policy to Congo right now. I'm not sure how much you're following. I mean, my sort of broad view on it is that there doesn't really seem to be any kind of policy. There's an idea that we need to grab the minerals, and that will be pursued in various ways, and that's about it. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your broad assessment. So, I mean, the first thing to say is that tragically, there is sort of parallels between the DRC today and Congo in 1960. The 2 main ones I'd say are you have a weak and dysfunctional central government that has legitimacy and popularity problems, and you have UN peacekeepers, struggling to maintain order, which is a symptom of that weakness. That weakness is what has encouraged and enabled Rwandan meddling in Congo, which has been a persistent problem. The U.S. brokered a peace deal, I think, in the summer between Congo and Rwanda. There are a lot of questions about that agreement. M23, the main rebel group, continue to hold significant swaths of territory. Violence persists.
If I may be permitted a cynical take, it seems to be one of those peace deals where people keep shooting.
Right. The fundamental problems have not been solved. And in the Trump administration's defense, those fundamental problems are very difficult, and previous administrations have not been able to solve them. And so you have this dysfunctional country, the DRC, that is next to a authoritarian but more functional country of Rwanda. And Rwanda views Eastern Congo as a sort of its backyard and justifies its meddling there by pointing to the rebel groups that sort of are the heirs to the genocidaires that fled Rwanda after the genocide. And so there's that. And then there's the whole mineral element added on top to it. You can get endlessly deep on Eastern Congolese politics and violence, but at some fundamental level, it's all about the weakness of the Congolese government. And that has been hard to solve. And that really, I think, all stems from the Mobutu era. I mean, part of it stems from just the inherent difficulty of ruling a country as vast and diverse as Congo, but also the Mobutu era really hollowed out any semblance of government and administration. And so in a way, the DRC of today, it's still living in the shadow of the 30 plus years of misrule under Mobutu.
In the light of a long American history of extrajudicial killings and other deadly meddling in other countries, of which the plot against Lumumba is perhaps just one prominent example, how do you see the current administration's targeting of boats in the Caribbean? I think this morning I scanned the headlines. It seems we're up to 20 or 21 boats blown out of the water for what actual reason we don't really know.
One of the big lessons of the Lumumba plot is that the White House can be very easily tempted by the promise of covert action. You don't need to go through Congress. You hopefully don't risk large-scale war. So in 1960, that meant CIA political operations and eventually after 1960, paramilitary actions in Congo. And today it's drones and maritime forces, but the underlying logic is familiar. And I think then there's the sort of Venezuela covert action element to this, which has been reported that the Trump administration has authorized covert action in Venezuela, whatever that means. And Maduro is no Lumumba, but one lesson from the Congo is that as bad as the incumbent leader is, what follows it can be even worse. That you don't need just the Congo for that lesson. Iran in 53, Guatemala in 54, the coup in South Vietnam against Ngo Dinh in 63, Chile in 73, Iraq in 03, Libya in 2011. I mean, you see a theme here of regime changes not turning out so well, and that they can backfire in predictable ways. The other thing that comes to mind is that there's often highly exaggerated national security threats are invoked, and that becomes the justification for extrajudicial assassinations, legally dubious maneuvers. And so you're seeing sort of a new mix of those familiar elements in the Trump administration's actions in the Western Hemisphere today.
I suppose what else is strikingly different is, you refer to covert actions, whereas sometimes I feel as though the point of the strikes on Venezuelan on boats in the Caribbean is almost the propaganda. It's the photos and videos on Twitter that seem to be almost the object of what they're doing.
Yeah, certainly deniability is not the goal here whatsoever. So that is an important difference. But at the same time, we do know through reporting, although maybe the fact that it's public undermines what I'm about to say, that there is a desire to effect some sort of covert action in Venezuela.
Right. Overt covert action.
Right.
We need new words for our current era. So just the last question, broad and, take on as much of it as you want. And, again, recognizing that a lot has changed this year in the first year of the Trump administration, not quite year. But how have the activities and the role of the CIA changed since the 1960s? Is it a completely different agency from the one that Larry Devlin worked for?
It is. I think the true Wild West era of the CIA was in the 1950s and early 1960s, really the Allen Dulles years mostly. A few things changed that. There was the Bay of Pigs disaster, which led to Dulles's ouster. And then in 1975, you had the Church Committee, which was charged with investigating misdeeds by the CIA and the FBI and others. You had Vietnam and Watergate, and I think that led to more congressional oversight, less public appetite for these sort of legally dubious and ethically dubious actions. Then you had the sort of post-Cold War contraction where, like the rest of the US government, the CIA was sort of looking around for what do we do in this new unipolar era. And then you have the 9/11 era, which was, the CIA becomes much more of a paramilitary counterterrorism agency. I think what you've seen recently, I don't know when exactly to date it, is with the return of great power competition, the idea that the CIA is sort of back to basics of analyzing Russia and China, taking on cyber threats. So there are these different eras of the CIA. I think the general trend is towards more oversight with deviations from that along the way. But in 1960, this was an agency that was able to do almost whatever it wanted. Allen Dulles had a tremendous amount of personal power. Eisenhower sort of reluctantly ceded great authority to him. And there was a lot you could get away with back then.
Right. I'm going to not be able to restrain myself from making a comparison to ICE right now. But perhaps let's just leave it at that.
I mean, and the other thing to just add is none of this was known really at the time. So one of the lessons here is that things take a while to come out. And it was really only 15 years after the Congo operation with the church committee that the assassination plot became known. So future historians may have new things to write about.
Thank you very much, Stuart.
Thank you for having me.
The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by Maria Repnikova and me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show's edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the Gudrun by Wolfé. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed by Wolfé. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you're doing, we'd love you to take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com. Thank you so much, Stuart.
Thanks for having me.